Hey guys, so for this week, we are going to talk about strategies for effective linguistic development on the year abroad. Just to forewarn you, I'm recording this in my sitting room with my dog next to me, so if you hear little barks every now and then, I haven't lost my mind. It's not me, it's my little dog wanting to get involved. So this week we're going to talk about the strategies for effective linguistic development. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at second language acquisition within the year abroad context. We're also going to talk about what we know about language learning on the year abroad from all of the pieces of research that have been done on the topic. We're going to talk a little bit about learner types and learner styles, because that's very important that you understand those and use those effectively when you're on your year abroad. We're also then going to talk very specifically about what aspects of language proficiency change on the year abroad and why, so that you guys have a more realistic expectation about the changes that you're likely to undergo in terms of your language proficiency. And then talk very briefly at the very end about the various language learning activities that you'll be presented with on the year abroad and their potential impact on your ability to use the language effectively. So, second language acquisition within the year abroad context. What is it? Second language acquisition, very simply, is the studies of the process through which one learns an additional foreign language. Okay, so we're not talking about first language acquisition here, so the language that you acquire through your childhood in interaction with adults and whatnot. We're talking about your additional language learning beyond that, and in the context of Ireland, we're talking mainly about foreign language learning. Okay, so SLA, second language learning, second language acquisition, looks at the process through which a person learns an additional language. So it's very much focuses on the perspective of the learner, okay? So we're not necessarily studying the educational process, so we're not looking at the teaching process. We're looking at it from a very learner-centric point of view, okay? So what do learners do when they are acquiring a second language? And what's really interesting about second language acquisition theory is that it's very much empirically informed and very much bottom up. So it's not a top down process where researchers come up with a theory and test it out in reality, but rather they look at what's actually happening in reality and develop a theory from there on out. Okay, so what SLA allows us to do as researchers, and then also in order to help learners, it allows us to generate a list of best practices for supporting learners in their language learning. Okay, and so really at the core, what second language acquisition is trying to find out or trying to understand is how human languages develop and the role that they play in our development as human beings, okay? And then why is SLA important to educators like myself? Well, it assists educators like me in understanding the practices and the ideologies, so the beliefs that learners operate under when they're learning a language, both in a learning classroom context and also outside the classroom context in a more acquisition setting, which is something that becomes the norm within the year abroad context. Okay, so when we're talking about second language acquisition theory, there's a huge number of theories out there that we can talk about, but really the most important and very early differentiation that comes up in second language acquisition theory, which is very important to the year abroad context, is this differentiation between acquisition and learning. So Stephen Krashen in the 80s came up with this theory in studying people using language both in the classroom and in the natural immersion environment. So he came up with the acquisition versus learning hypothesis. So really what we're doing is, if we look at the left-hand side here, under the natural environment, we're talking about acquisition. So what happens within the natural environment? Well, learners are seldomly corrected. Yeah, they're not very often given corrective feedback. Okay, whereas when we're talking about obviously the classroom settings of the learning context, learners are always given corrective feedback by the teacher within the classroom. Within the acquisition side of things, we're talking about there's no necessary structure to the communication process. So new structures are not presented in a step-by-step staged way. Whereas within the classroom context, the language is taught, and taught is very important here. in a very structured step-by-step approach. Okay, so out in the real world, in the immersion side of things and the acquisition side of things, you're not necessarily going to be presented with structures in a step-by-step way. You're going to have to deal with unusual structures that can pop up from time to time. Obviously, within the acquisition context, we're talking about learners being exposed to language for hours on end. Yeah, so, and in the context of year abroad, certainly the all waking hours, which is fantastic because it gives you a huge amount of exposure. Whereas within the classroom context, you're really only given exposure to the language for a small number of hours per week. And it's normally very much controlled exposure. Yeah, so it's not necessarily the language used in isolation. Sometimes it can be scaffolded by the use of English as well. Within the acquisition environment, we're talking about the native speakers are the majority of the people within the sociolinguistic setting. Whereas in the classroom situation, the non-native speakers are the majority of people within the context, and even the teacher themselves may be a non-native speaker, which is of course the case in my own context. And then within the acquisition environment, we're also talking about moderated input, okay? And that's very seldomly available in the acquisition environment. Why? Well, it's very seldomly available because when people speak in a natural environment, they're not moderating, they're not editing what they're saying to make sure that it's appropriate at the level of the person that they're interacting with. So, whereas within the classroom context, moderated input is pretty much the standard. We're talking about the teacher making very clear decisions on what sort of structures they use in order to make sure that people within the classroom context understand and can follow everything that's going on. That level of structure is not necessarily going to be present within the acquisition environment, and that's something that you guys will have to come to terms with when you're in the year abroad context. So, what do we know about language learning on the year abroad? And this is applicable both to the ELA as well as the Erasmus University placement, okay? So we know that it's not just a case of being immersed in the environment with lots of native speakers around that is the most beneficial to language learning within the year abroad context. What we know is that actually it's a combination of the immersion and formal classroom learning that provides the best conditions for second language acquisition within the year abroad context. So for you guys that are going on the Erasmus, make sure you're doing some modules that are devoted to language learning. So modules that are devoted to learning German as a foreign language alongside the immersion that you guys are going to have outside the classroom setting. So therefore you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. For the ELAs, do a couple of evening courses. There's plenty of providers out there in Germany that will offer very cheap language classes. And it's really, really beneficial to you guys to keep actively working on learning the language as well as applying it then within the acquisition context. We know that from a lot of the research that's done that student expectations about language gains are often unrealistic. Why do you guys think that might be the case? So just pause this for a second and think about it. So really, it's unrealistic for a couple of reasons. First of all, we know that there's very often a clear mismatch between people's expectations going abroad and the amount of language that they're going to use and learn and what actually happens in reality. And the problem with that is it can lead to disenchantment. So people can feel really, really disappointed and unmotivated if their expectations don't live up to what's happening in reality. And what can actually happen then as a result of that is that learners can fail to exploit opportunities for language development fully. Okay, so when you're going abroad, be realistic about what you expect to get out of it in terms of your language development. Because if you expect too much of yourself, you may find that you end up demotivating your language learning, and you may then withdraw and not make the most of the learning opportunities that are out there for using the language actively. We know that training prior to the year abroad is a really, really useful tool to guide students in making the most of the year abroad's potential for linguistic development. And that's why this module exists. And that's why, for example, I give this particular lecture, because I want to make sure that you guys understand that, you should be thinking about this in advance and you should be preparing for these kind of things in advance. And if you do, you're going to make the most out of the process. So, from looking at Fried's research, we know that there are some key factors that influence people's language development, both within the natural learning process, but specifically also within the year abroad context. So we're talking about individual differences and learning styles, and we'll come back to that one in a couple of moments and look at them more clearly. Motivation and aptitude. So the more motivated you are, of course, and the higher your aptitude for language learning, the higher the potential for language development. Linguistic differences between the target language and your own first language makes a big difference. So German and English, both being Germanic languages and sharing a lot of commonalities, is actually a very positive thing for your guys' language learning. Now, that's not to say that German and English don't have a lot of differences between them, but you've been focusing on those differences quite a lot during your learning experience up until now. So that kind of awareness is something that will be very useful as well while you're on the year abroad. Your degree of immersion in the speech community is really important. We've spoken about this time and time again. So make sure that when you're living there, that you're obviously immersing yourself as much as possible so that you're speaking to native speakers on a daily basis as much as you can, and that you are, you know, in your living situation being in interaction with native speakers. That's really important. And then this combination again of the natural learning environment, the acquisition environment, so the day-to-day use of language in the real world, and also some formal classroom learning, trying your best to combine the two to create the best circumstances and the best context within which you can improve your language learning. Obviously, you know, one of the big kind of points important to mention from the outset is that there's no guarantee of language development. Just because you guys are going on the year abroad doesn't necessarily mean that your language is going to develop massively. Really, it is you as the learner that determines the scope for development. So you control the extent to which your language learning takes place. It's not going to happen by osmosis. It's not going to happen by accident. You really need to guide the process as much as possible. And we know from a lot of studies, including I've studied here, that the degree of social integration of you within the context in which you're living on your year abroad is a central determiner of language development. Pause this for a second and have a think about why that might be. Why is social integration so important for your language development? Well, again, we're coming back here to the idea of living arrangements with native speakers. You want to be making sure that your default languages while you're living on the year abroad is German. And, you know, look, now and again, you may fall back onto English. You might decide you want a little bit of a break and you speak a bit more English. That's absolutely fine. But make sure that your default language is German. Make sure you're engaging with native speakers beyond the superficial daily interactions of maybe brief chats in the classroom or chatting to someone at the bus stop or in the supermarket. You really want to make sure that native speakers penetrate your friendship circles, yeah, so that you actually make friendships with native speakers, so that on a daily basis the language of interaction is really what is really done through the medium of German, because that's going to make a massive difference to your ability to use German effectively. And we also know as well from looking at these studies on the year abroad that not all aspects of language proficiency develops equally in scope and in depth. Okay, so different aspects of your language will increase, other aspects may not necessarily increase or might only increase slightly. Okay, and we'll come back to that in a couple of minutes again. So learner types and learning styles is really important to this entire process. And for those of you who've maybe done a little bit about this already in first year critical skills, or potentially also in primary or secondary school, this is really good for you to kind of reflect on what your learner types and learner styles are. So when we're talking about learner types and learner styles, what we're doing basically is talking about the way a learner learns best, okay? So they are the approaches that students use in order to learn about a new subject or to cope with a new problem. So they are kind of our default settings, our internal cognitive settings that we use when we approach a new thing. And 4 factors influence this. Our sensory preferences, so we're more visual, more auditory, more kinesthetic, and we'll come back to those in a couple of minutes. Your personality type, whether you're more introvert or extrovert. Your degree of generality, so whether you tend to like the big picture, you're a blue sky thinker, so to speak, or whether you prefer granularity and really like to drill down a little bit. And then also biological differences. As much as we don't like to acknowledge it, there are some biological differences between men and women that do make a difference in terms of learner styles and learner strategies. And as we know from the research as well, not not a single person is identical when it comes to learner types and learner strategies, because we all have different strategies of approaching new topics. We dip in and out of the different types of learner types and learner strategies. So we're all very individualistic in that sense. Okay, so we'll end it there, and part 2, you can click on that once you're ready. Thanks, guys.